session order. This work session dealing with JBER. Go around the table, identify ourselves for record. Mr. Fleming.
Amy Domboski, representing Shigeaki Glover and JBER.
Hugh Peterson, wonderful Muldoon.
Dick Turnley, somebody. How's it break down?
Ethan Berkowitz.
Jessica Johnson.
Okay. So we'll turn this over to administration, I think. Or is it JBER that's doing this?
We're
You doing the presentation?
I think we're going to start with the mayor making some introductory
Mr. Mayor.
remarks.
Sure. I just wanted to let you know the news out of Washington was good last week, but we are still going to continue to do the economic
Full court press.
Pardon?
Full court press.
Well, we've got to make sure that it's a long-standing commitment on the military's part. We have to overcome some of the consequences of sequestration, and that's also driving some of the strategic decisions. So hopefully they can get their budgetary act together. But we also have to continue with the economic analysis that we're doing so we can be better prepared to be better partners with the military, as well as be resilient in the contingency that something unpleasant happens moving forward. So we're in the process of working those economic analyses.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Who do we have that's going to be doing this presentation today? Do we know?
I am, sir.
Okay, sir.
Hello, members of the Assembly and members of the public. My name is Marcus Hartley. I'm president of the Northern Economics, local economics consulting firm, and we're the ones that have been selected by the municipality to work on the analysis of the impacts of the personnel reduction out of JBER. And glad y'all could attend. I'll just flip to the next slide here, I hope. Our agenda today will be to provide some comments, to give you a project overview of how we're going about our study, give you an update of some of the progress that we've made, and then kind of open it up to you guys to provide us some input, have some discussion about how you feel the base force reduction could affect the city. We'll have some closing thoughts and then we'll adjourn. All right, of course, you're all very familiar with what the issue is. In July 2015, the Army announced the 4th Infantry Combat Brigade would be reduced. We're calling it the 4-25 ABCT. It will be downsized by 2,631 active military personnel, down from some numbers that we are estimating, the base population at 4,526 down to 1,895. And that's a reduction, depending on the numbers that are out there at JBER, of 45 to 60% of the military personnel actively stationed out there. So the project team consists of, and I've got these slides are all printed out on the paper handouts here, by the way. The project team consists of Northern Economics, and we're leading the process and doing the economic impact analysis. We also have AECOM, which is a large consulting firm. They have large office here in Anchorage. They're heading up the public process, gathering information from lots of folks. And then we also have some GIS folks doing work, the Alaska Map Company. We're going on a three-pronged approach. Basically, we're looking at a quantitative approach that will use some highly regarded and in-depth economic models, and basically to see what we can talk about quantitatively about the base impact, the reduction impact. We're also recognizing, however, that our quantitative models, even though they're really good quality models, and we're pretty proud of them, don't get at a lot of the kind of personal issues, individual businesses, individual areas of town that get hurt. It can look at Anchorage as a whole, Mat-Su as a whole, the state, but can't look down any closer than that, really. And so we're using a qualitative approach that involves the public, you all here, members of Anchorage's community at large, and bringing in their input to the extent that we can. Our third approach is a mapping approach, a GIS approach, which will take as much of the kind of quantitative information that we can put places and locations on, and to try to provide a visual impact analysis, if you will. And well, that's a summary of the three approaches that we're taking. Go back here to our quantitative approach. We have the Alaska REMI model, which is a very high-level tool that we've used for several years in Alaska. We use it to look at, say, the pipes of the effect of the Alaska Pipeline Project or the effect of Watana Dam. It's a dynamic multi-year model that allows us to look at the effects of a change over time. Captures the multiplier effects of the economy. It's a great model. The whole process is basically we calibrate the baseline, make sure the baseline looks like what Anchorage is. Then we shock the model with the change that is being proposed, which is basically a 2,600 person reduction of the military force and then all of its spending. And then we'll summarize the results in terms of changes to population, changes to employment, changes in sales, housing prices, etc. And then we'll capture all of those things. But at the city as a whole, or at the borough level for out in the Mat-Su. The qualitative approach involves basically four kind of focal points. One is a set of public meetings that we've already held. The second is a bunch of focus groups where we're gathering people together and talking and asking them about how they think the base closure will affect them. We're doing a series of key informant interviews with folks that we think are particularly important to get and talk to. And we're also conducting an online survey with the help of the municipality. And y'all can fill out the online survey if you'd like, if you want to put your personal opinions in there. That's the website. There's also a business survey that we're asking people to fill out as well. Just a quick summary of our GIS approach, our mapping approach. This is an example where we've highlighted the base entry there on Vaga, and the darker shaded areas show the 5-minute drive distance of all the businesses around there that have that 5-minute drive. And so you can kind of see how we're going to try to show where the impacts are likely to be. And that's just an initial example. I'm going to stop here and let my colleague at AECOM, John Isaacs, many of you know, talk about some things on the public meeting. And I might jump in and then probably give it back to John a little bit later.
Thanks, Marcus. Good morning. We appreciate the opportunity of being here. As Marcus mentioned, we had really 4 types of public outreach. And part of this is to make sure that we have a broad opportunity to reach the general public, stakeholders, key business leaders, to get their ideas, get their input, get their suggestions on what we look at in the study. So the first piece of this was 2 public meetings that we've already held. And in addition to giving them a briefing similar to the one that you're having today in terms of what's the purpose of the study, what we're going to be doing, what's the nature, the key part was they gave comments from them on what they see as some of the potential economic and community impacts from base reduction. One of the key pieces is what is the economic role of the military in Anchorage and in their communities? What would be the economic impacts of force reduction? And what would be some suggestions on how the Muni and others in the military might reduce those impacts if force reduction occurs? So the first meeting we held at Begich Middle School on March 8th, attendance 25 people. We had good attendance from the mayor's office and from the BER working group, public members. And the second meeting was held at Greening Middle School on March 9th. And we'll talk a little bit about some of the outcome of that in a second. Marcus, you want to flip the screen
here for you?
Perfect. As Marcus has mentioned, we also have online surveys, and there's sort of two purposes on that. One is to provide an opportunity to the general public to provide the survey, and so far to date, I think we've gotten 21 respondents to the surveys. It's really a fairly qualitative survey, again, trying to get ideas on what people's concerns are, what they see as some of the impacts, not something particularly statistically robust, but it allows us to look at where and how some of those impacts occur. And then we also are following up with the business survey. We did have a fairly broad outreach to a lot of people to attend the focus groups. Not everybody could, and so we provided them with an invitation to go ahead and fill out the survey and give us some additional input on that. Okay. So we have 8 focus groups that we're working with, and of those, 5 have already been conducted. The first one was a housing focus group with realtors, housing providers, others in terms of looking at what they see the potential impacts and concerns with force reduction and some suggestions. We had a large-scale retail focus group, which had a lot of the major malls and businesses around the base and some of the other major retail operations that have a sort of an intersect with the base. We had one with the community councils, and then we also had one with the recreation and tourism industry. The one still to be conducted, this meeting today, getting your input on some of your thoughts and concerns and suggestions. And then we'll also have one with Eagle River businesses and with Government Hill and Mountain View businesses, to look at those businesses that are specifically very close to the base and they see the concerns and impacts might be. Marcus, you want to talk about?
Yeah, I'll talk about our key informant interviews a bit. We're talking to several folks that really who are really going to be influential in telling us how their interests are affected. Certainly, we're trying to talk with folks from JBER, and we're counting them obviously as one of our key informant interview sets. We're also talking with folks from the Anchorage and Mat-Su school districts. We've gotten from them very nice data sets telling us the numbers of military associated children in each of their schools, and we found some surprising information out of that. For example, about 2/3 of the children of active duty military at the base as a whole are Anchorage school district children, and then but a full 1/3 of the children are out in the Mat-Su borough, and that's maybe not surprising to you all, but it certainly is information that we hadn't really been able to quantify in the past, that about 1/3 of the kind of families from JBER are out in Mat-Su. We're not able with either of those to necessarily distinguish between Fort Rich and Elmendorf, and that's kind of one of the difficulties of our study, is being able to drill down to that kind of higher level of information.
Mr. Flynn has a question for you, sir. Mr. Flynn?
On that specific point, do you have a feel for how many active duty members have actually moved their families here as opposed to those who had their families someplace else?
We think that it's about a 1/3, 2/3 folks that live on base and folks that live off base. And then we know that there's about if you take for example, the number of active duty military is about 11,000 to 12,000 right now, and the estimates of spouses and dependents are about 30,000 for the base as a whole. We don't have any information of unaccompanied soldiers that do have spouses and children that aren't with them. We don't have that information, but we could try to find that. It hasn't been on our radar screen to try to get that particular piece.
I'm gonna, after you're done. let me know.
Yeah, I think, just based on my interactions with the military, I think that's a not insignificant population of people that at least try to get a feel for what we're, on base, off base, that's one issue. But in Alaska, not in Alaska is, I think, a pretty significant, more significant factor that needs to be one.
So, Mr. Clerk?
That's it.
Mr. Bosky now?
I would just say that would be the opposite of my experience. I grew up in a military home and I was in the military, and my personal experience is it was very rare to find a military member that moved here without their family.
You worked in a wartime footing. There's a lot of deployments where mom and kids go home.
Well, the military can tell you on their database how many are deployed at the times you're still here. I used to run the database for military, and we could print that out any time we wanted.
Yeah, unaccompanied is something that the military tracks, and so just asking for it, and they can tell you how many unaccompanied folks are there. But I think
the family support on JBER, both Army and Air Force, they can give you the exact data.
I think that Amy's logic is pretty true with regards to Alaska.
Well, continuing on, we're going to be also talking with the universities as well as the schools, the public schools, hospitals, and the Veterans Association. Hospitals are one of our reasons to talking to hospitals is that we've heard a lot of folks saying that military spouses, a lot of them work in as nurses and in the hospitals because they're very transferable skill sets. So that's one of the things that we thought we could, with hope to try to get at is where the military spouses work at. We're also talking to utility providers and other major contractors for the base. We've got a list of all the contractors, and we're kind of working through some of those that are major providers. We're looking at the transportation and storage sector. We know that a lot of the goods and services or the goods anyway, come through the Port of Anchorage. The moving groups and storage associations, storage folks are also heavily involved in the process. We're also talking to the native corporations that are out there, including us, Siri, are both going to be on our target list. So a long list of interviews, and we're moving through those. The study's not completed yet, but doing what we can to finish those up. I'm now going to jump back to John and kind of get into kind of more formal, informal discussion phase of the process today.
So I think our intent was, in addition to providing a briefing, to ask you, with your expert knowledge as elected officials, as representatives, what are some of your observations about the military's role in your districts, and what might be some of your concerns and things that we should look at? And so these are similar questions that we've asked of the business community, but we've kind of tailored them more to assembly members. So these are really, they don't have to be answered specifically, but they're for discussion purposes to sort of get a feel from the assembly in terms of what you see as some of the patterns and some of the concerns. So I guess we're kind of interested within districts within the muni, what role do you see the military playing? What's their importance? What's their value? What percentage of your constituents are military? And do you see any spending or residential patterns from military members that are different from your other constituents? So I guess with that, my suggestion would be to sort of open it up to the assembly and see if you have some observations, questions, suggestions on this suite of topics.
Ms. Nabowski, you're first because you got the highest percentage of military of anybody in your area.
I do.
Then we'll go to you next.
Thank you. So I have the pleasure of representing Worksession-JBER, and not only active duty military, but retirees. Our district has the highest population of those in our area. And I would say from our perspective, not only in our schools, but in our community, we have a lot of engagement, especially with spouses and children. So whether it's in youth sports or the jobs within the Eagle River community, it'll be hard for us to walk down a street and not have somebody associated with the military. When it comes to spending patterns, obviously, they frequent our local coffee shops and restaurants and all of that, but what we do see, even with the retirees, most of them that I know go on base to the commissary to do their grocery shopping because it's more cost effective, frankly. And we still see them utilizing a lot of the VA and the hospital resources on base versus off base. From those that I know that go off base, it's only in an emergency when they can't make it to base for the most part. But with that said, I think obviously from our district's perspective, any drawdown will have a significant impact, not only on our local businesses, but also on the attendance at schools, all of those things. And I think it's important to recognize, how big of a population there is in Eagle River. So from that perspective, I came up here. My dad was military. That's how I got here. And I think from our perspective, it's one of the reasons why we're so close to the topic and we're watching, and we interact very closely with our federal delegation too, because we know more than any other part of the municipality of Anchorage, Eagle River would see the biggest significant impact by any significant drawdown.
Great, thank you, Ms. Denbosky. One question we've heard and we're going to try to explore is, what is the relationship between the existing military, force and some of the services they provide to retirees, veterans, and things like that? And if there's a drawdown, is there going to be some effect on those other services? And those, it's kind of important to get concern.
I'll address that. I got here via the military. I came up here in 1981 on a ship to do work with NOAA, and I fell in love with it. I was not married at the time, and I would come and go. I came for an assignment, 2-year assignment, went back out for 2 or 4 years, whatever it was, and then came back up. The next time I came up, I moved up because I had a family. Families either love it or hate it, and it depends upon the family. Some people just can't adjust to Alaska. They were born and raised somewhere else, and they miss mom and dad, and so on and so forth. So my experience is both of those from people that I've known. And then I retired, and the people I know, like I said, either love it or hate it, and their families sometimes they love it, the families hate it, and that causes all kinds of issues. But in my estimation, the military and the civilian sector around this base are integrated, totally integrated in terms of on base, off base, and you don't necessarily know who's military, who's not military when you meet people on the street or in business or whatever it is. I do not use the commissary, but I use the medical facilities. I still go for annual checkups, even though I've been retired for some time, at Ellendorf, because they allow me at the hospital because they're not overly impacted. So I do my physicals there, and I also then interact also with the VA. So to me, this is a perfect place. A drawdown, a significant drawdown at Ellendorf would be more impactful than we would like to think. And I think it's a stupid political move too. I mean, or a military move, strategically. But people are interwoven. Some of them, in my case, when I had my kids, they were actually, my wife preferred going to, because her doctor was at the civilian hospitals. And so my kids were both going there rather than Elmwood. But people come on and off the base and interact in the sector, in the private sector, just like everybody else. And so you don't know how many people, how many of your neighbors are military. You might see them in uniforms and that, or retired military. Retired military is a huge segment of the population that would be impacted. If they drew down significantly, we would lose the medical service. We'd probably lose the VA service as well, and that would be a huge impact for those that are retired.
Thank you, Mr. Steele, very helpful.
Mr. Peterson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Well, in Muldoon, I've done my share of walking in that part of town. We figured that over 10%, if you include family members, were active duty military. And if you include former military and retired military and their families, it was well over 20%. So if you're going to take 10% of the population out, we're going to have huge vacancy rates in apartments, and housing values could head downward. Businesses could be closing up. It would have a significant effect in Muldoon. It would have a big effect in your district as well. But I think R2 would probably be the most immediately affected.
Go ahead, ma'am.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just a comment, okay? I've been in this community for 33 years, and I can tell you that probably 90% of the people that I meet, and the famous question is, oh, how did you get here? And 90% of them are from the military. So I think I'm the only one who wasn't. But it's pretty amazing when that question's asked, the answers that you get. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
I came up in 26th of April, 71. I stepped off the plane in Elmwood. I didn't retire until 92. I spent my whole time up here in the military, as my friends did. We're so integrated, we're across the spectrum. And we find each other in the commissary. That's the one equalizer we have. We find people we didn't even know were in the military. You guys know Mort Plum from the airport? We always find it interesting. People don't know he was in the military, but we find each other there. But we're across the spectrum. We have the largest percentage of retired military in this state. And for years, I used to run, it was out of family support, would ask people where they want to live when they come up to Alaska. River Chugiak was number one priority, is where they wanted to go. And they would put their dream sheets in. Alaska was a place that was always on the dream sheet, where they wanted to go. So to shut Worksession-JBER down would be a travesty, because I'm concerned about what happens to our hospital. We don't have the activity to support it. So, just from my perspective, it's a dumb idea when you take a look at the geopolitical aspect of where we're living in now. We don't have a lot of friends out there, so why would you want to cut down an active duty deployable force? Makes no sense. Jennifer?
A couple things. One is just sort of the history, of course, the military in Alaska. And we all, I think, are pretty familiar how the military actually built Anchorage and and what's happened out in the Aleutian Islands. But personally, I didn't come up here until 75, but my husband first was in 69, and it was during the draft, and he realized that he was going to get drafted, and moved back to Alaska knowing that Alaska was very good to their veterans. And so his point was he was going to join the military from Alaska so he could become Alaskan as a military member. So The other aspect is I've often wondered, for just a sociological study, actually an economic and business study, the retired military that then becomes part of our infrastructure. We've had many people in the military who have had directorships within the school district and within, right now there's more in the school district than there were in the municipality. A couple years ago it was flipped. Our airport, more plum, our utilities, we've had a man from the military that's gone through almost all the utilities. Pilots, a lot of ex-pilots end up going with Alaska Airlines, or then they also end up being part of the infrastructure. So and I'm not, I think it's good. It's just also something that it's an impact.
And again, I think that's an example, as Marcus is mentioning, we can look at the quantitative and the economic impacts, but there are also some community impacts that are related, whether it's people staying, whether it's leadership positions, whether it's spouses that provide part of the workforce. So this is all very helpful type of information here.
We take a look at the benefits supplied to the military. That's the reason a lot of military retire from here, quite frankly, is the military benefits. As a retiree, I looked at that when I was retiring. Yes, Mr. Flynn?
Yeah, I have more questions and comments, maybe to consider. One is, Mr. Steele kind of referenced it and has been trained in, the functionality of medical facilities. You have a drawdown. Most of my experience with the post was with the civilian side, and that they have a number of programs that they operate in Anchorage and Alaska. We're from somewhere on that side of it, and what the effect might be if there's a smaller operational footprint. Do they then scale back their environmental programs? Do they then reduce their draw on oil and utilities and the capital program associated with that? And I don't have a good answer for that question, but it's just that's sort of where my experience lies, or where my curiosity goes. My district is at the gate in two different areas, Government Hill and Boniface is right around the corner from Mountain View. And some of those businesses are relatively heavily patronized by on-post personnel. Might be interesting to find out from those that do delivery how they've been affected by the increased security requirements, whether their business has already dropped because it's harder to get on post. And if so, would that mitigate the impact should there be a drawdown? I'm also interested in hearing about the opinions on housing, and obviously we have a shortage of housing in Anchorage. Would that be no one wants to see the value of their home drop, but if it frees up some housing stock and creates some mobility in the market, is it a good thing or a bad thing? And then finally, the thing, growing up here, I was the affirmative action program with my high school senior basketball team. I was the white guy. And my perception is that the military has driven a significant portion of the early diversity in our community. More recently, it's been migrants from other parts of the world, but a lot of people moved within the United States to Alaska with the military and stayed. And so I'd be curious just about the socioeconomic and ethnic diversity and how that might be affected by a drawdown.
These are all very good questions and good questions for us to hear at this stage of the study. We're hearing some similar echoes in the focus groups and others, so the commonality is also very interesting to hear.
We have more comments.
I failed to mention, I was on the school board for 9 years, and the school district and runs for military personnel mainly, mostly, about 6 schools on the base. And that also, one of their schools that they emptied out because of population decline is also the secure computer facility for the school district. And so there's intermingling of actually operations and things on the base that would be impacted if they drew down, or if they because of a lot of their units are young people, paratrooper divisions and things like that, that may not have dependents. You may have to close a number of schools on the base, but actually they're closing one right now that is a special ed program. But the interaction between the base and the community it's inextricably intermingled, and the impacts you might not be able to figure out what they would be at this point, but a significant drawdown, or even a change in the mission card thing in terms of the age of the people. Do they have dependents or not? Is going to make a big impact on this.
Mr. Peterson, and then the mayor.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I was going to mention too that the education across the city might be affected. Everything from elementary schools to the university. I know a number of people that are in the military get additional education, when they're stationed here, and so that would have an effect on the university, not to mention all the elementary schools and high schools in the area.
I've taught for UAA on Illinois Fort Ridge for 15 years, and they have tuition assistance. They give them military. A lot of my students, I had 50 people, they were all military. So we got to take a look at the impact upon University of Alaska Anchorage. Look at Wayland Baptist, because they all teach out there. They use tuition assistance for the students. If the amount of reduced out there, there'll be less students doing that. Mr. Mayor?
There's also some reciprocal impacts, and the one that springs to mind right away is the question of the port, which is a militarily strategic port, and having a strong port does a lot to retain the military's interest in Anchorage and Alaska. And to the extent that we can quantify that, it would be extremely helpful. I know that there are those who would suggest that we don't need a port, but I would think that those who would say that we don't need to modernize our port might be also in a difficult position when it comes time to argue on behalf of the military.
On that specific point, I believe Port of Anchorage is one of
23.
I think 2 that the Corps actually dredges to the dock base. And if it loses its status as a strategic port, then all of a sudden that dredging responsibility shifts to us. Most likely.
It's got a long-term lease.
Yeah.
Anyway.
So, just some other questions. These are more for just letting you know what we're asking, because I think we've already heard some of these and some of your comments, but we're looking at, more details. What are the impacts in terms of revenue, employment, seasonality, level of service? That's really kind of a business. We're also looking at, and it's obviously on your minds, and we've heard it from the business sector, is what other factors and trends can amplify and offset potential economic impacts. And if you're looking at a downturn in the oil industry, downturn in the mining industry, looking at some other economic forces, this obviously plays into that, and that's information that we have heard in our key informant interviews to date. And I think you're giving us a good idea of other concerns and areas of impact that the study should address, and there's perhaps a mechanism as you think further to get back through the mayor's office. If there are other things that you want to make sure that we're looking at in the mind after the meeting today, it'll help us look at the analysis and what we look at in the study. So one thing we did talk about, and I think there's some interesting questions there, is what can we do to reduce impacts? And if the force reduction does occur, what are some negotiating points? What are things that the Muni can do? What can others do? And we have heard some themes from some of the sectors. I think one here today is that if there is going to be a reduction in the force, can you get a commitment from the military to maintain the level of medical and other services so that is not reduced in proportion to the reduction in force? So I think we're going to be looking for things, and this is an opportunity to work with the mayor's office, to work with the JBER working group, Bill's group, to get out in front of what are some items we should look at to try to mitigate it.
Another thing would be land they've got out there.
Yep.
If they're gonna reduce, they've got some great floodplain lakes out there. I can tell you exactly where I'm talking about.
6
Been there
Mile,
numerous
6 Mile
times.
Lake?
Huh?
6 Mile Lake.
6 Mile Lake would be a wonderful part of Anchorage.
Eagle Road.
Well, but when we take the large landowners, that's JBER. It owns a lot of land. And if they reduce the forest, they don't need it.
Mr. Chairman, to that point,
Mr. Hunt.
I believe it was during the last BRAC round, which is, what, 10 or 12 years ago now.
Yeah, about that.
At the time I worked with a guy who spent a fair amount of time in the military, retired as a 4-star.
Didn't run a railroad, did he?
Maybe for a little while. And his strategic thinking at the time, I don't know if he still believes this, was that Alaska should pursue a 4-to-3 strategy, where you consolidate the Army activity, for example, at Wainwright, and in return you get, at the time, Richardson back for development. And obviously, the fact that they went to a joint base reduced the likelihood of them being reduced in that particular round. But it's something to keep in mind if we're going to have a negotiation and they're going to really reduce the Army's presence here. How do we gain benefit for the community and getting some of that land back? My dentist insists it's the best developable land in Anchorage.
It's not wetland. It's the best land there is.
So I hope we'll get to that point, but if we do, that might be something to think about.
I like them to see them increase reserves. If we're gonna decrease active duty forces, to plus up the reserves, both the Guard and the reserve forces, to see if they could offset the active duty and by reserve and Guard. Mr. Steele?
Yeah, my concern is that I do not believe that the military understands what the impacts might be. Elsewhere, they can draw down and then turn around and build it back up a couple of years later and so on and so forth. I don't think that's the case in Anchorage. If they do a significant drawdown, you're going to have impact to the civilian infrastructure around it and to the population. I think a lot of people would leave. Civilians might leave as well. And when it comes time they want to build back up, the civilian infrastructure is there to protect. Schools would be one, but it's a sensitive balance. I mean, it's a very synergistic relationship that the military has with the civilian population, especially.
Just one quick question. I go to you. I saw how many active duty, but how many civil service workers are going to be eliminated too? Because they've got a certain proportion. Have they said how many of those are going to be eliminated?
They really haven't, and they have told us that one meeting that we had, it seemed like they said, yeah, don't worry, that's not part of the reduction. Is kind of what they said. In some
I hope the
way,
workers understand
Well,
that.
they said that they'd already drawn down some of the civilian support previous to this announcement, and so they did not envision additional civilian decreases due to the 2,600 and the 425 reduction.
We might want to talk to the union out there and ask them if they share the same opinion. Because it's not the military that wants to drive this down, it's the politicians in DC. They're trying to figure out how to make their numbers work. They're trying to drive this down. Mr. Peterson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I think one of the unknowns in this situation, and there are quite a few unknowns, is how many of these people would like to stay in Anchorage. I mean, a lot of people come up here in the military, never been here, and once they get here, they don't want to leave. And so they stay here and work, and like Mr. Steele and many others. So many of them might decide, well, maybe I'll stay here in Anchorage, you know, if their time in the military is up and they don't have to transfer to another base somewhere. Maybe they'd like to stay here and try to get a job or something. So that's something else we need to try to drill down to. Maybe Bill knows more about that.
I'm going to go to Bill in a second, but that's where we get a lot of our police from, is from the active duty base. We're looking to increase our police force to recruit. That's where we go, because they've got skills we can use and convert them over to being civilian police officers. Mr. Pop, sir.
Mr. Chairman, I can answer that question at least in terms of the normal retirement cycles that we see in the military across all military branches, including the Coast Guard, and our work with the folks who do the professional transition work with these troops for the year leading up to their separation and in the months that follow. Their survey work says that 1/3 of the troops that separate every year stay. 1/3 would want to stay if they could find a job, and 1/3 are going home no matter what you wave in front of their face, because they're going home.
That's usually because the family doesn't want to be here. As you were saying earlier, if mama's not happy.
Well, you got to remember the proportional numbers, especially on the Army side, are mostly single, and those are single troops going home.
I ran that program,
yeah,
the transition program, for a couple of years,
yeah.
And believe me, we had the stats to tell us when they wanted to leave and why they wanted to leave. And if your family's not happy, we're not staying in Alaska, no matter how much you like cutting fish. So, anyway, go ahead, sir.
Well, I think,
Sorry.
you know, really appreciate you, Mr. Chair, and some of the members. This has been very valuable for us to hear this type of input. So maybe, you know, this might be a point to sort of turn it back over to Marcus for the close, and then we can see if there are any other questions.
Marcus, sir.
Well, my close was simply going to be a quote from the mayor. I was hoping he was going to still be here, of course, but basically, he had said at one of our meetings, I think, that while we hope to dissuade Washington from a forced reduction, we are taking the prudent step of finishing up this study, preparing for its impacts, and so your participation is greatly appreciated, and we're going to do what we can to fully document the impacts that we think that are going to happen from this kind of proposed reduction. It's now been put on hold, but the proposal is still there, and we're going to have to do what we can to get to it. So anyway, I appreciate you all coming and participating, and that's really the end of what we have today. We would welcome any further discussions that y'all might want to participate in, questions, answers, anything like that.
Well, if you'd like us to participate, just tell us what you'd like us to, when you'd like to talk to us, because a lot of us, like I said, been involved in this space for a long time.
Okay. Well, we appreciate that, and I've written down a lot of notes, and I think that we will probably be following up with some of these.
This work session is over. Thank you.